Hi there guys, I hope you are having a good day. Grab yourself a cup of tea and let's talk some boxing. And let's also remember that England are going to the final at the Euros. That is incredible because that's the first time that's happened since what, 66? Is that the first time? I think it is. So that's incredible. England going to a final once again, overcoming the obstacle of going 1 goal down against Denmark and having to come back. That was just incredible. Kane missed the penalty but then scored the follow-up. So it was a great match, great game, and England now move on to Italy, who I think they can beat. I think that England are actually the better side. It's just whether they can hold their nerve and get the victory. But anyway, let's go on to boxing. Now, Dillian Whyte is in an interesting position at the moment because obviously he was going to be mandatory this year, but then had that slip up against Povetkin. So he had the return match and now he's back on course. WBC Interim World Champion. Apparently he could become mandatory next year, but that has kind of been thrown into question by Mauricio Sulaiman. This is what he had to say. At this point, there is no mandatory contender in the division. We have this fight happening on July 24th, and afterwards we will be addressing this matter. We have just seen the news that Whyte will be fighting in August. We have not received a sanction request from Dillian Whyte and his team. That's what we saw in the news. This is always an ever ongoing situation. There's not much I can say right now. We're in a process that we have to deal with, and as soon as we have news about this matter, we will be letting you know. So there we go, that is what Mauricio Sulaiman has had to say about the possibility of Whyte becoming mandatory. Now, it is interesting how he's decided to kind of avoid the situation with Dillian Whyte at the moment, saying he hasn't really heard too much. They haven't asked for any kind of sanction because obviously Dillian Whyte is within the WBC with his interim status. So he does have to get a sanction from that governing body when he fights, otherwise the interim title might not be on the line for his next contest. Interestingly enough, according to Eddie Hearn, it was actually Alexander Povetkin who briefly became mandatory. I'm not sure if this is true. This is only what Eddie Hearn revealed. But he said that apparently Povetkin became mandatory for a brief moment in between the first and second fight with Dillian Whyte. Then Dillian Whyte was never instated as mandatory after beating him. That was never publicly announced, so we don't really know how much truth is in that. That is just coming from Eddie Hearn. Now, of course, next they are undergoing negotiations with Jermaine Franklin for Dillian Whyte's next fight. Trevor Bryan was also a fighter they were looking at, and perhaps Charles Martin, Chris Arreola, those kind of guys. Obviously, Dillian Whyte wants to fight 3 times this year, so one around summertime, maybe late summertime, then one in the winter time, probably around November, December. And he's already mapping out what he is going to do, looking to fight in the US. One thing he will also have his eye on is the situation with Tyson Fury and Deontay Wilder, and his mandatory position, a world title opportunity. If Dillian Whyte wants that fight, then he needs to keep winning, of course, then he can hopefully become mandatory, which we did believe was going to happen next year, but given what Mauricio Sulaiman has said, that doesn't really give us much hope that it will happen. Of course, there is Wilder Fury 3, and that is the thing to focus on at the moment, but a governing body would be looking at that and thinking, we have a mandatory coming up. The IBF were doing that when Anthony Joshua had his rematch with Ruiz. They had their mandatory they wanted to call, and they were actually lucky to be able to have that title on the line for the Ruiz rematch, because if you remember when Tyson Fury won it from Vladimir Klitschko, Tyson Fury was ordered to fight his mandatory but could not because he was contractually obligated to face Klitschko again, and of course that one never happened. But still, because he was going down the route of fighting Klitschko in a rematch, which he had to because of the contract, he was then stripped of his IBF title because he could not face his mandatory, and the same thing could have happened with AJ and Ruiz because AJ lost in the first Ruiz fight, which was a voluntary. Then obviously the rematch was essentially a voluntary defense from Andy Ruiz, meaning that the IBF wanted to call their mandatory but didn't, and allowed Anthony Joshua and Ruiz to fight for that title once again. then they called them mandatory. So you would think that the WBC, regardless of the situation with Wilder and Fury, would be looking at their mandatory position. And with him saying a decision is still to be made, what that means is I think he's looking at Tyson Fury versus Wilder and possibly thinking there could be a fourth match. So if Wilder were to win, I would imagine there is a rematch clause in there for Fury. I mean, Fury's not going to go into this fight and not have a rematch clause. So maybe he's looking at it thinking, if Wilder wins, then we have a fourth fight this year. So therefore, we're not going to call him mandatory or even think about that if we don't know what happens in this one. But you see, the thing is, it's not down to the WBC or any governing body for that matter to be thinking about rematches and ordering them or sanctioning them based off of a contract that is agreed between two fighters that does not involve said governing body, because when a mandatory is called, as we know, there cannot be a rematch clause unless a deal is made before purse bids are called between both parties and they can agree a rematch clause and maybe give the challenger a little bit more money for his efforts because there's a rematch clause in there, and maybe make it a more handsome split in the rematch favouring the challenger if he is to win. So given that, the WBC should not be looking at what happens between Fury and Wilder. They should be looking at, okay, we want to call our mandatory because we want to give this guy an opportunity. They have no reason to be thinking about, okay, what if there's a fourth fight, then Tyson Fury or Wilder cannot face their mandatory. It shouldn't be that kind of situation. They should be looking at it thinking, we're going to call our mandatory regardless, and they'll just have to sort out that situation, because that is what the IBF would do. Different governing body, of course, but still, a mandatory is a mandatory for a reason. That is because they have worked themselves into that position to get an opportunity. And what was the last mandatory for the WBC? It was Dominic Breazeale back in May 2019. And after the trilogy fight, that will be 3 voluntaries made by a WBC world champion. I guess that a new champion is then able to have 1 voluntary. I believe that that is the case. So this will be that voluntary for Tyson Fury because he's not mandated to fight Deontay Wilder. So this will be the voluntary. Next must come the mandatory. And it even says in the WBC rules, fights ordered by them take priority over options by promoter and fighter. So in light of that, the WBC have the power to say that Dillian Whyte gets his opportunity after the trilogy fight. They have the position and the standing to be able to say that and to make sure that that happens, but they don't seem to want to do it, whether it's because of a potential undisputed fight happening after, or whether it's because of the possibility of Wilder Fury 4, but Tyson Fury has said he wants to remain active after Wilder, so he will likely take another fight this year. Why should it not be Dillian Whyte if he is to beat Deontay Wilder? But the WBC still do not seem all that keen to call Dillian Whyte as their mandatory, and it doesn't even look like they have any plans to do so after Wilder Fury 3, because that is coming up very soon, and Dillian Whyte will be looking to get out around August time. Although as of yet there have been no sanctioning requests from Eddie Hearn or Dillian Whyte, that is due to the fact that they are still in the early stages of negotiations with the likes of Jermaine Franklin for that fight date in America. Anyway guys, what are your thoughts on this? Dillian Whyte still isn't going to be mandatory to Tyson Fury or Deontay Wilder because the WBC and Mauricio Sulaiman have their eye firmly on the trilogy fight and seemingly nothing else. Anyway, drop your thoughts on this in the comments below. Also leave a like and grab that subscribe button. Thanks guys.